What if the justice system designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty opened its doors and a killer walked free? In 1966, 3 innocent teenagers were abducted, tortured, and murdered on a dusty stretch of road in central Texas. One of them, a young girl, was found with a broomstick shoved down her throat. The killer was caught, tried, and sentenced to death. It should have ended there. But it didn't. Because decades later, due to a decision buried in bureaucracy and fueled by overcrowded prisons, that same killer was released into a world completely unaware of the monster they were welcoming back. And almost immediately, women started disappearing again. Their bodies began turning up in ditches, behind motels, beneath bridges. Each crime more brutal than the last. Each one eerily similar. Authorities soon realized they weren't just hunting a killer, they were chasing a man who had already been caught once and let go. This is the true story of Kenneth McDuff, the man they called the Broomstick Killer. A name etched into Texas history, not just for the horrors he inflicted, but for the law he forced the state to rewrite. Stay with me because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, second chances, and evil. If you have not subscribed to this channel, do it now and turn on the notification bell icon as we dive into this story proper. Kenneth McDuff was born on March 21, 1946, in the small, sun-baked town of Rosebud, Texas, a place where folks left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved from front porches, and where danger was the kind of thing you only heard about on the radio. But from the very beginning, McDuff stood apart. One of 6 children in a working-class family, he didn't blend into the rhythms of a quiet Southern upbringing. Instead, he carved his own path through intimidation and cruelty, becoming the kid you crossed the street to avoid, the bully teachers whispered about in break rooms, and the teenager who laughed at pain, manipulated those around him, and was already known by locals as someone who relished violence for sport, eventually earning himself a nickname that would stick like blood on concrete, the meanest man in Texas, and it was a name he wore with pride, swaggering through his teenage years like he owned the backroads and back alleys of Falls County, drunk on his own reputation, and driven by an appetite for control that only got darker with time. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened on the night of August 6, 1966, a night that would forever stain the soil of Texas, when McDuff, alongside his easily manipulated and terrified accomplice Roy Dale Green, spotted 3 teenagers innocently parked near a baseball field. Robert Brand, just 17 years old and full of promise, his cousin Mark Dunman, 15, still a boy, and Edna Sullivan, Robert's 16-year-old girlfriend, the kind of girl who smiled with her whole face and trusted too easily. What happened next unfolded like a scene torn from a nightmare. McDuff forced the trio at gunpoint into his car, drove them to a secluded pasture outside Everman, and without mercy, ordered the boys to kneel before executing them with a .38 caliber revolver, coldly, methodically, like it was nothing more than routine. But the horror didn't end there. McDuff then dragged Edna into a thicket, raped her, and in a final grotesque act of brutality, strangled her with a piece of a broomstick, shoving it down her throat with such force that it would later become the defining detail of his evil, earning him the infamous title the Broomstick Killer, and turning an ordinary cleaning tool into a symbol of everything monstrous about one man's thirst for dominance, control, and suffering. When Roy Dale Green broke under the weight of guilt just days later and confessed to the police, the full story came to light, and the community, already stunned, recoiled in horror. A trial followed swiftly, with McDuff showing not a flicker of remorse as he was sentenced to die in the electric chair. A punishment most agreed was far too merciful for what he'd done, and so it seemed that justice, at least in some form, had been served. But what no one could predict, what no family of the victims could imagine, was that Kenneth McDuff's name would not fade into death row obscurity. In the early 1970s, the United States Supreme Court made a historic decision when it ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, at least for the time being. For some, this meant a glimmer of hope for a second chance at life. But for others, like Kenneth McDuff, it was a catastrophic gift, one that would soon be used to claim more innocent lives. The Texas man, convicted of a heinous triple murder in 1966, had already proven his capacity for unimaginable violence, but in 1972 his death sentence was commuted to life in prison. He would serve time surely until the day he passed away in his cell. Or so the people of Texas believed. What they didn't know was that the justice system, already struggling under the weight of overcrowded prisons, would soon make a disastrous choice. By 1989 the state was in crisis. The prison system was bursting at the seams, and a rush to relieve overcrowding led to the early release of thousands of prisoners, many of whom had committed violent crimes. McDuff, despite the vicious nature of his previous killings, was just another name on the list of those let out on parole. He had served over 2 decades, and the parole board, with its flawed review system, made the disastrous decision to release him, seemingly overlooking the fact that he was a time bomb waiting to explode. But what made McDuff so dangerous wasn't just his brutal past, it was the chilling, methodical way he planned to finish what he started, and the horrifying reality of what would unfold in the years that followed. Released into a world unprepared for his return, McDuff wasted no time in returning to his monstrous ways. He was no longer just a killer, he had evolved into something far more dangerous. A predator on the hunt. In the span of just a few years between 1990 and 1992, he would go on to kill at least 9 more women, and possibly more, targeting the most vulnerable in society, women who had little protection, few resources, and fewer chances to escape. These were women who, for whatever reason, fell through the cracks of society. Sex workers, runaways, women in desperate circumstances, people no one cared to look for until it was too late. His pattern was chillingly consistent: abduct, rape, torture, strangle. Then, as if to erase his existence from their lives, McDuff would dump their lifeless bodies in remote, desolate areas, far from the prying eyes of the public. The bodies were often found in isolated locations, along Texas backroads and wooded areas, with little to no evidence to lead investigators closer to him. McDuff was a ghost, drifting in and out of towns, like a shadow that left no trace. He knew how to cover his tracks. He was meticulous. He had learned from his previous mistakes, and he was patient. He wasn't in a rush. It was a slow, calculated hunt. Some of his most well-known victims include Colleen Reed, a young woman abducted from a car wash in Austin in 1991. Her disappearance, though highly publicized, would lead investigators down a path of frustration, as they were unable to find any clues to her whereabouts for months. Then there was Valencia Joshua, whose burned body was found near Waco in the same year. Her body was so charred, it was almost unrecognizable, making the case even harder to solve. And what about Melissa Northrup, a pregnant woman abducted from a convenience store, who was never seen again? She vanished without a trace, leaving only heartache and unanswered questions. Brenda Thompson's cries for help went unheard when she screamed from the side of the road as she was abducted. Her fate, like the others, was sealed in darkness. There was also Regina Moore, Cynthia Gonzalez, Sarah Ann Harbor, and Valencia K. Joshua, all taken, all forgotten by most, but never by the families who suffered their loss. Yet, despite the bodies piling up, McDuff moved on. He was calculating, methodical in his cruelty. He didn't rush, he learned from each kill, perfected his methods, and struck again. The pattern was there for anyone who cared to see it, but no one had yet connected the dots. The authorities, exhausted from their endless work in trying to track down an invisible killer, began to wonder just how many victims were still out there, waiting to be discovered, buried in the forgotten corners of Texas. As McDuff moved between small towns and empty highways, his killings became a twisted routine. With every murder, he seemed to slip further from the reach of justice, as though the system had not only failed to protect the public, it had paved the way for him to continue his spree. So, as McDuff disappeared into the night, leaving bodies behind in towns rattled by fear, one question loomed large: how many more women would have to die before someone finally stopped him? Was this a flaw in the justice system that could have been prevented? Or was it the inevitable consequence of a system built to overlook the true dangers lurking within it? How could the state have let him go free? And more chillingly, how many more victims would be added to the list before McDuff's reign of terror finally came to an end? Let me know in the comments what you think. Was the parole system broken, or was McDuff always going to slip through the cracks of justice? By 1992, the terror that Kenneth McDuff had unleashed on the state of Texas had reached a fever pitch. The bodies were piling up, and his twisted spree of violence had escalated to the point where law enforcement could no longer ignore the nightmare he had become. It was no longer just a series of isolated disappearances, it was a pattern, a killing machine in motion. With every passing day, the authorities were faced with the chilling reality that they had not only failed to stop McDuff but had inadvertently allowed him to continue his reign of terror. The justice system had failed, and now it was time to face the consequences. As the number of victims grew, so did the sense of panic. The people of Texas, once certain that they were safe, now lived in constant fear, unsure who would be next. With each new murder, the frustration of the detectives reached new heights. There were no answers, no leads, no closure. But then, in 1992, as the terror continued, a new ray of hope emerged: a national manhunt. The search for McDuff would be expanded beyond Texas and into the broader United States. It was no longer a local issue. It was a crisis, a hunt for a monster, and it was time for the country to take notice. McDuff's face, once known only to a small group of law enforcement officials and residents of the areas he terrorized, was now plastered on the screen of America's Most Wanted, the popular TV show that had helped capture countless criminals on the run. The nation watched as his name was announced, his picture flashed, and the chilling details of his crimes were revealed. People all over America now knew his face, and they were on high alert, hoping that someone somewhere might have the key to finally stopping him. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A tip from Kansas City, Missouri was called in to the authorities. Someone recognized the face, someone who had seen McDuff, or at least someone who resembled him, in their area. The tip seemed to come out of nowhere, but as investigators followed the lead, they soon found themselves chasing a phantom, an alias that McDuff had been using to stay off the radar. He had gone underground, adopting the name Richard Fowler, living as a drifter, bouncing from one place to another, blending in with the crowd, and leaving no traces of his true identity behind. It was as though McDuff had become a ghost, slipping through the cracks, staying just one step ahead of the law. But his arrogance, his absolute certainty that he would never be caught, was his downfall. Despite the countless lives he had destroyed, despite the fact that he was now a national fugitive, McDuff never seemed to believe that he would actually be arrested. It was as if, in his warped mind, getting caught wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. And even more chillingly, he wasn't afraid of that moment. In fact, he expected it. When McDuff was finally tracked down and arrested, it wasn't in some high-stakes showdown or dramatic takedown like in the movies. No, it was far more unsettling. He was found working a mundane job, living a life far from the infamous killer the world knew him to be. He was just another drifter, another man in a world full of nameless faces, blending in, hiding in plain sight. The detectives who arrived to take him in described his demeanor as chilling. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't worried. In fact, they said he was cocky, almost amused by the fact that they had finally caught up to him. During his interrogation, he was described as smiling, almost boastful. It was as if he took pleasure in the fact that he had played the system, that he had outsmarted everyone who had been looking for him. It wasn't regret they saw in his eyes, nor fear. No, it was the smirk of a man who had been playing a game that had now come to an end. But the scariest part? The truly unsettling realization that sent chills down the spines of those who worked the case was the chilling fact that McDuff didn't seem afraid of getting caught. He expected to be. His cockiness, his utter lack of remorse or fear, was a stark reminder of just how dangerous he had been. It wasn't a fluke that he had gotten away for so long, it was a result of his carefully calculated plans, his ability to disappear into the shadows, and his complete confidence that nothing could stop him. And as the interrogation continued, one thing became painfully clear. Kenneth McDuff wasn't just a monster. He was a man who had learned to manipulate the system, to use it against those who sought to stop him. He didn't fear the consequences of his actions. He feared nothing at all. He had always known he would get caught, but he didn't care, because in his mind the damage had already been done. As McDuff sat there, smug and unrepentant, the question loomed, how had a man like this slipped through the cracks of the justice system for so long? Was it just a matter of chance? Or was there something more sinister at play, something even more disturbing than we could have ever imagined? What was it that allowed him to remain free, killing again and again? What happens when a system designed to protect the innocent instead becomes the vehicle that allows a monster to escape the consequences of his actions for so long? After years of evading the justice he so rightfully deserved, Kenneth McDuff's reign of terror finally came to an end in 1992. The monster who had slaughtered at least 9 women after being released from prison, whose name had struck fear in the hearts of countless Texans, was finally convicted for the brutal murder of Colleen Reed, one of his most notorious victims. Her disappearance, a haunting chapter in McDuff's bloody spree, had finally brought him back into the grasp of the law. For years, authorities had failed to stop him. They had missed the warning signs. They had allowed a convicted killer to roam free, killing again and again. But in the end, it was the murder of Colleen Reed that became the tipping point, the moment when McDuff could no longer slip through the cracks. The trial that followed was as harrowing as the crimes McDuff had committed. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. McDuff, the man who had turned his life into a sadistic series of murders, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The victims' families sat in the courtroom, their eyes filled with anger, grief, and a burning desire for justice. For them, this trial wasn't just about one woman, it was about the entire string of lives McDuff had destroyed, the families he had torn apart, and the years of pain he had caused. They knew that even if McDuff was convicted, it would never bring their loved ones back. But it would be a moment of reckoning, a small piece of justice in a world that had failed to stop him sooner. As the verdict was read, it felt as though a weight had been lifted. Kenneth McDuff had been found guilty for the murder of Colleen Reed, and in that moment the nightmare was finally over, or so they thought. But even as the gavel struck, McDuff remained cold and unyielding. He had evaded capture for years, and now, even in the face of his conviction, he showed no remorse. His cold, unrepentant demeanor served as a chilling reminder of the monster he truly was, a man who had murdered without regret, without hesitation, and without a shred of human compassion. For the next 6 years, McDuff languished on death row, awaiting the inevitable conclusion of his life. The Texas justice system had failed once, but now they had the chance to make things right. He had been granted parole once before, and it had been a disastrous mistake. This time there would be no second chances. The state had made up its mind: McDuff would die for the crimes he had committed. The public, the victims' families, and the law enforcement community all agreed the time had come for McDuff to face justice. And so, on November 17, 1998, after years of legal battles, the day of reckoning arrived. Kenneth McDuff was led into the death chamber at the Texas State Penitentiary. The cold, sterile room was the setting for a final chapter in the life of a man who had taken so many. As the lethal injection was prepared, the tension in the air was palpable. This was the moment when the man who had evaded justice for so long would finally pay for his crimes. But even as the needle was inserted, even as his life began to slip away, McDuff remained as cold and detached as ever. He didn't cry, he didn't beg for mercy, and he didn't confess to the horrors he had committed. He simply stared forward as though lost in his own thoughts, unaffected by the gravity of the situation. His lack of emotion, his complete indifference to the lives he had taken, was chilling. It was as if, in his mind, the people he had murdered were no more significant than the countless nameless faces he had passed by in his life. And then in his final moments McDuff spoke. His words were simple, but they carried an eerie weight. As the drugs began to take effect and his body began to shut down, McDuff, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering, uttered the words that would be forever etched in the minds of those who witnessed his execution. "I'm ready to be released. Release me." A chilling statement, almost as though he had come to see death as just another release from the torment of his existence, a final step in a life filled with violence and bloodshed. There was no remorse, no reflection on the lives he had destroyed, just an eerie acceptance of the fate he had earned. McDuff's words would haunt those who had lived through his terror, a stark reminder of the monster he had been, and the indifference with which he met his end. And as the drugs took their toll, as McDuff's heart stopped beating, the room fell silent. The state of Texas had executed a man who had caused more suffering than most could ever comprehend. But even in his death, Kenneth McDuff left behind a trail of unanswered questions, of lives cut short, and a haunting legacy that would not be easily forgotten. The justice system, for all its flaws and failures, had finally caught up with him. But was it enough? Was it truly justice for the families who had lost so much, or was it simply the end of a long and painful chapter? What happens when the monster is finally silenced, and all that remains are the scars he left behind? After Kenneth McDuff's release and subsequent reign of terror, the state of Texas was left to pick up the pieces of a broken parole system, one that had failed the victims, the families, and the entire community. The shockwaves of McDuff's crimes reverberated throughout the nation, forcing lawmakers and law enforcement to confront the glaring flaws in the way violent offenders were treated. The consequences were undeniable. McDuff had exposed the vulnerabilities in a system that had previously been too lenient, too quick to grant second chances to individuals who had already shown a capacity for violence. In the wake of his killings, Texas responded with a fierce determination to ensure that no one would suffer the same fate again. The result? A sweeping overhaul of the state's parole laws. No longer would violent offenders be released on parole without thorough, careful consideration. The mandatory release for prisoners like McDuff was repealed, and in its place new laws were put into effect, ones that demanded a more comprehensive approach to parole decisions. These changes came to be known as the McDuff Laws, a set of reforms that would change the way Texas dealt with violent offenders for years to come. Under these new laws, parole boards were now required to conduct detailed risk assessments, incorporating psychological evaluations, criminal history analysis, and importantly, input from victims and their families. Every case had to be reviewed individually, ensuring that dangerous criminals like McDuff would no longer slip through the cracks. McDuff's legacy was not just the carnage he left behind, but the reforms he forced upon a broken system, one that had allowed him to slip through and wreak havoc on the state. His name would forever be linked to the changes in Texas parole laws, a dark reminder of the cost of inaction, but also a catalyst for reform. McDuff had exposed the cracks in the system, and Texas had sealed them with concrete. But even as the laws changed, the question remained, would it be enough to prevent the next McDuff from slipping through? Kenneth McDuff. His name is forever associated with brutal killings, a failed parole system, and a chilling legacy of violence. But to understand the true horror of McDuff, we must look deeper into the darkness of his mind. He was a man who showed no remorse, no regret for the lives he destroyed. His actions were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, nor were they the actions of someone who felt any ounce of guilt. McDuff reveled in the pain he inflicted, taking pleasure in the terror of his victims. He was a man who looked into the eyes of his prey and saw nothing but opportunity. He was charming when he needed to be, able to weave lies with such ease that even those closest to him could be deceived. But beneath that facade there was a sadistic monster, a pathological liar, a manipulator, a killer. McDuff fit the textbook profile of a sociopath and psychopath, lacking empathy, driven by an insatiable need to dominate, to control, to destroy. He didn't just kill for survival or even for power, he killed for the sheer enjoyment of the act. The thrill of inflicting pain, the rush of terror in his victims' eyes. In McDuff, we see the frightening reality of a mind that is not just broken, but fundamentally wired for destruction. He didn't see his victims as people. They were objects, pawns in a game that he played with terrifying expertise. The question we must ask ourselves is, what makes a monster like McDuff? Are killers like him born with an inherent darkness, or are they shaped by a lifetime of trauma and choice? Could McDuff have been saved if society had intervened earlier? Or was he simply destined to kill? If this story gave you chills, hit the like button. Would you have supported his parole back then? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more bone-chilling true crime stories every day. You won't want to miss the next deep dive into the darkest corners of criminal history.